In the personal story segment tonight, nurse Jill Stanek testified in front of the House of Representatives before that body passed the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. Ms. Stanek works at the Christ Hospital in Oak Lawn, Illinois, where, according to her, some babies have been birthed and then were allowed to die. Ms. Stanek joins us now from Chicago. She says, you know, most Americans don't even know this story because the mainstream media isn't covering it. I think we're the only ones on television covering it. And as you know, the ban on this passed overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives,
right.
the Infant Alive Protection Act. But I was stunned to hear that there are babies being allowed to starve to death. Is that what's going on?
They probably don't live long enough to starve to death, but they are being aborted, oftentimes alive and allowed to die, yes.
When you say oftentimes, talk about your personal knowledge of this. You work in a hospital called Christ Hospital. Is that a religious hospital?
Yes, it's associated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America and United Church of Christ. And
they allow abortions?
I was very shocked to find out after this all started that they are pro-choice denominations.
All right, so they allow abortions to take place, and sometimes the abortions are not completed inside the mother's womb?
That is never the intent. The type of abortion that Christ Hospital performs and others is called induced labor abortion, or now known as live birth abortion. And the technique is done so that the baby will die during the birth process or soon after, but not necessarily in utero.
And up until what time does this procedure take place as far as the trimester is concerned?
It usually happens during the second trimester, but I know that Christ Hospital has aborted into the third trimester.
And when it doesn't work, the baby is born then. And that's the Infant Protection Act we're talking about, correct?
Right. What happens is the doctor or the resident inserts a pill into the birth canal up to the cervix, which is the opening at the bottom of the uterus, that causes this opening to open prematurely. And so the second or third trimester baby that is still very small, in essence, just falls out of the uterus once the cervix opens far enough. And that's how it comes to be that sometimes these babies are born alive.
And then what happens after they're born alive?
If they're born alive, the hospital only mandates that they get what's called comfort care, which is wrapping the baby in a blanket, offering the baby to the parents to hold, and if the parents don't want to hold the baby, then it is left to nursing staff to hold the baby or put the baby somewhere until the baby passes away. And that's where I became personally involved when a co-worker of mine was taking one of these babies, who was a Downs baby, who was aborted between 21 and 22 weeks, alive, to the soiled utility room when she told me what she was doing, and I stepped in and said that I couldn't let this baby die alone, and I held him for the 45 minutes that it took for him to die.
I don't know, I really don't know what to say. How often does this happen?
I know the stats at Christ Hospital, and from 95 on, they've aborted between 11 and 26 times a year.
In this procedure?
Right.
When the baby's been born alive?
Right. About half I'm kind of aware of about 9 or 10 abortions this year, and about half the babies have lived, and each of those babies has lived between an hour and a half and 3 hours just this year alone. I know that one baby in particular has lived almost as long as an 8-hour shift.
So basically the doctors and nurses just don't feed the baby and just...
Well, they don't really live long enough to be fed or...
Well, if the baby's 8 hours, what does the baby die from?
The baby dies because it suffocates, that it is not meant to breathe this early on. Its lungs aren't mature, so it is like a fish out of water.
Your compatriots in the hospital, they're all aware of this, right?
Right. It's not something that the hospital ever advertised, and as a matter of fact, I worked in the department for a year before I ever even knew that this went on, and stumbled on it quite by accident one night when I came in to report and heard in report that we were aborting a Down syndrome baby, a different one, between 21 and 22 weeks. Otherwise, I was never told in my interview or during my 12-week orientation. It just so happens that if you happen to be there when one is going on, sometimes that's how you find out about it.
But the doctors and the hospital personnel certainly have to know. What do you think about the 15 people who voted to allow this to continue in Congress?
I think that probably their elections are in danger. We've got one here in Illinois, Jesse Jackson Jr. I just don't understand how anybody could
I don't either, Ms. Stanek. We're going to name those people when we come back, and we thank you very much.
You're welcome.